Good afternoon. If you've just joined us, we're just waiting for the numbers to keep on coming in here. People are joining us at a very rapid speed, so we'll just give it a couple of minutes whilst we get a few more on board, and then we'll be good to go. Okay, we are looking pretty good. So good afternoon. Welcome to all of you to the GRESB 2021 EMEA Infrastructure Results event hosted in partnership with EVORA. I'm David Thomas. I lead business development here at GRESB for our infrastructure platform in EMEA. Just looking at the numbers again here, it's great to see so many of you signed in and participating today. I think it's a pretty good reflection really on the hugely encouraging the hugely encouraging increase in participation we've seen across both our fund and asset assessments this year on the infrastructure platform. I think this increase in engagement really does exemplify once again just how vital ESG considerations are to our industry. Looking forward, we have a very exciting year coming up here at GRESB with the development of our TCFD tool and primarily our Sfdr reporting solution, which will enable our members to confidently meet their mandatory reporting requirements. We look forward to telling you more about these tools and developments during the following results presentation. We've got a packed program coming up for you today. We'll be kicking off with the results presentation and sector leaders in Q&A first with our colleagues here at GRESB. We will then be moving on and have Katrona Brady, who's Director of Strategy and Development at the World Green Building Council. Katrona will present on WGBC's latest report entitled Beyond Buildings, Integrated Sustainability in Vertical and Horizontal Infrastructure, State of the Market Report. We'll then have Fraser Hughes of GLIO, the Global Listed Infrastructure Organization. Fraser will take over, will talk us through the GLIO ESG Index, which was developed in partnership with GRESB, setting out its objectives and process. And finally, Nick Hogg, Director at EVORA, will present on the needs and the issues of data collection and data for asset management and reporting purposes. So finally for me, before I hand over to our host today, Matthew Brundell, Director at EVORA Global, a quick bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and the entire program, including the slide deck, will be posted online and sent around to all of you after the event. We'd love to have your input today and to make the sessions as interactive as possible. So please do utilize the opportunity to ask our speakers any questions using the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screens. And there will be time for live Q&A following each of today's sessions, so there's plenty of opportunity to be involved. So without further ado, let's get into today's program. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, David, for your introduction. And on behalf of EVORA, I'd like to extend my welcome to you all and thank you all for attending today's event. Next slide, please, if we could just, thank you. So just before we progress with this year's GRESB results session and the presentations, with just under a week to go to COP26, we couldn't let the opportunity slip by without reflecting on the importance and the role that infrastructure can play in addressing many of the priorities being discussed and hopefully actioned over the coming weeks. For anyone who's not already aware of the main goals of COP26, here are the 4 main objectives, simply summarized and extracted from the COP official guide. And these are secure global net zero by mid-century and keep to wind within 1.5 degrees within reach. This one is the main media, has main media attention, and I'm sure familiar to you all. Secondly, adapt and protect communities and natural habitats. Certainly here in the UK, this one has received less attention, but is of equal importance and not to be forgotten. And in my view, there is no credible pathway to net zero that cannot be done if we don't take a full account of the natural world and the communities which are impacted by our activities and lifestyle. Thirdly, mobilise finance. Not really being covered in the media as much as it should be, but certainly relevant to everyone who's attending this year's event. And nothing, of course, can be achieved without the collective understanding and the support from you all within the investment community. And finally, work together to deliver. The next 10 years are critical and billed as the decade of action. This requires each and every one of us to work and to work together within the built environment sector and to come together to deliver the actions that are required. So 4 very key objectives to be addressed coming up. Next slide, please. I want to point out a few macro challenges and so a few stats driving the demand for sustainable infrastructure, namely, in the first case, population growth. The global population is expected to reach 9.7 billion people by 2050. This places huge demands on existing infrastructure and drives the need for new sustainable infrastructure. Secondly, urbanization. By 2050, more than 2/3 of the world's population will live in urban areas. This means existing infrastructure will need to be adapted and new smart infrastructure will need to be developed. Thirdly, economic growth. World economic growth is expected to double by 2050 in both the advanced and the emerging economies. The emerging economies are even growing twice as fast as those of the advanced economies, so some huge opportunities through that impact. And of course, not leading to the last, but climate crisis. By 2050, many of the world's major cities are already known and will be under significant threat of flooding, just to name one climate threat alone. Clearly, infrastructure has a direct influence and will, of course, be impacted by each and every one of these challenges. It is also important to recognise that infrastructure underpins every aspect of society, and whilst much attention is given to the need for buildings and to decarbonise, the interconnections between the built environment is not widely discussed. And it is not understating the fact that if our buildings and our cities can't decarbonise without the right infrastructure as the foundations of all of that. Next slide, please. What is needed in the next decade is an immediate and tangible actions that can be tracked and reported against recognised goals. Fortunately, the UN SDGs already provide an ideal globally agreed framework of 17 goals and 169 targets, which are supported and promoted by the World Economic Forum in their recent report measuring stakeholder capitalism, for example, the UN PRI, and of course GRESB. I'm sure many of you will have come across at least the SDGs at the goal level and may even have some of these measured in some of your assets. What I think will be a surprise to some of you and want to draw your attention to is the full extent to which the infrastructure assets can make contributions to the UN SDGs. On the screen at the moment is a summary of a report recently published in Nature Sustainability, in fact in 2019, and the report concluded that the infrastructure sector either directly or indirectly influences the attainment of the UN SDG goals, including 72% of the 169 targets. So massive impact across all aspects of the UN SDGs. For 5 of the 17 SDGs, 100% of the infrastructure assets have a direct influence on those. In Catarona's presentation, she will update and explore the merits of the SDGs in the World Green Building Council report published earlier last week. Next slide, please. As a point, for those of you who are finding it difficult to conceptualize the implementation and the delivery of the SDGs and applying them to your investments and your portfolios, I would like to take the opportunity to quickly plug the GRESB and CFA guidance published last year. It will help you practically work through the goals. The guide can assist you with embedding them into your strategy, asset plans and activities, your due diligence processes, and measurement and reporting frameworks. Please do go and check it out, and where possible, integrate the SDGs into the management of your asset investments. Next slide, please. This slide is from the World Economic Forum and Oxford Economics report published in 2017 and illustrates the global demand and the gap in supply for infrastructure investment, which is estimated to be in the region of $94 trillion. It is evident that the market, and therefore the potential to introduce transformative and sustainable infrastructure, is enormous. The challenge is to provide the right infrastructure which addresses the climate crisis and has reduced impacts on environment and society. Getting this wrong today will, of course, have negative legacy impacts and challenges for future generations. In the study, it was estimated that a further $3.5 trillion would be required to meet the UN SDG goals for electricity and water supply alone. So enormous potential. Expected market growth within the sector and the demands on both public and private capital to be put to good and effective use means that investors and society really strongly need to look at not just their value creation, but how they impact on society at a wider level. And ESG reporting is becoming integral to that justification. It is also noteworthy that both in the UK and in the US, both administrations have made a huge play on building back better and to use infrastructure investment as a central platform to tackle the COVID recovery, the climate change, and of course, the levelling up agendas. Given these expectations, it goes without saying that investors need to have clear, credible and transparent ESG reporting, and these need better ways to measure value, both in terms of investment returns, but also in the wider society and environmental value. In Fraser's presentation later, he will explore and give experience on the insights from the GLIO-GRESB ESG listed infrastructure index, which was launched last year. Next slide, please. Increasingly, we live in a world driven by data and influenced by data. Data is and will increasingly be used to demonstrate and inform ESG strategy development and its implementation. Secondly, it is integral to the requirements of new regulations and legislations, such as the EU taxonomy and sustainable financial disclosure regulations. Thirdly, it is also required to meet industry best practice, such as the Task Force for Climate Related to Financial Disclosures and the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Standard. Fourthly, GRESB participants, of course, you will recognise and be aware that performance data is central to your annual disclosures and that scoring is progressively being biased towards performance data. And finally, data can and of course should be used proactively to manage business enterprises, helping them to optimise their business performance alongside their ESG duties. So data is incredibly important. In our third presentation, my colleague Nick will explore some of the issues and trends that we have noted from the real estate sector clients. He will explore if there are any data sources and data management processes in the real estate sector that could be deployed within the infrastructure sector. There will also be, as David has said, a short survey gauging your opinion on the needs and issues associated with data within the infrastructure sector. If I could have the next slide, please. And finally, before I hand back to our GRESB hosts for the awards part of the ceremony, I'd like to remind you all of the importance of the GRESB Climate Resilience Module questions, which of course were introduced this year and will increasingly become an important element of future submissions. And it goes without saying, incredibly important as part of addressing TCFD. If you haven't already fully onboarded TCFD within your assets, I'd like to quickly draw your attention to the recent published guide by Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance and advisor to COP26. The guide provides some valuable focus on the four important aspects of climate responsible finance, namely reporting, improving the quality and quantity of reporting, risk management, both physical and transition risks, including climate impacts and regulatory and market reforms, financial returns. Of course, we talk about the negatives, but clearly there are potential opportunities for transitioning to a net zero carbon future. And finally, mobilization, potential for developing emerging economies for both public and private financial institutions. GRESB will present some quick stats on their findings based on this year's resilience indicators, as well as the new TCFD alignment reporting tool, which will help get participants familiar with the requirements which they do not yet currently meet. And at this point, I'd like to hand back to our GRESB hosts to undertake the awards. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. And we would like to introduce you today to the GRESB Results Infrastructure of 2021. Again, as mentioned earlier, this year we were really pleased to see yet again really great growth in terms of participation, both across the funds and the asset assessment. Both of these assessments saw an increase of over 25%. And on top of this, we saw, the underlying facilities taking a 35% increase as well, bringing us over to the 2,000 facility mark. On top of this, we also saw 10 more countries covered, as well as 33 of our 34 infrastructure sectors. So that's more or less at the high level. But if we delve into the fund participation, what you can see here is in the upper graph that we have reached 106 funds this year who received a fund GRESB score, i.e. they participated with their assets. This is a growth over last year, which was at 75. And in the lower chart, we can see that the overall number of fund participants has grown to 149 from the 118. And in other words, what we're seeing this year is, whereas last year, out of every 10 funds, 6 of them would participate with their assets and get a fund GRESB score. This year, the figure would stand more around 7 out of 10. So we are seeing positive growth in that regard. In Europe, we continue to see the largest number of participants, as well as the globally diversified funds. In the bottom right-hand side of the figure, you'll see 3 numbers there. So what those represent, as you can see in 2021, is from the funds who do participate with at least one asset, on average, what percentage of their assets are reporting to GRESB. And as you can clearly see, that figure is edging closer and closer to the 100% mark, standing at 83% this year, which is a really good testament to the growing coverage that the benchmark has, and the completeness of the data across the data set. So moving on to the participation of the assets, you can see here that once again, the number has jumped up from 426 to 558. And most of the growth this year stemmed from the European region. However, respectively, so in terms of the respective numbers of the regions of America, Oceania, and Asia, we also saw strong, relative growth in that sense. So really great numbers across the board. And if we take a look at the sectors, we saw primarily growth in the transport sector, as well as the renewable power sector. So both of those respectively increased by about 50 assets each, which was great, amongst obviously other sector increases. In terms of the GAV, we also saw a good bump up in terms of the GAV in billions there. You can see that figure in the bottom right of the graph. So again, overall, really good numbers for participation this year. So we are very pleased about that. So without further ado, let's delve into the results. And just before going in too deep into the results, for those who are not too familiar with the full structure of our assessment, we just want a quick refresher. You can see here in the bottom 3 boxes, so those that are in green, the structure of the asset assessment. So you have a performance component, a management component, which then feed in to the GRESB asset assessment score. These GRESB asset assessment scores then feed up into a performance component of the fund assessment, and this, accompanied by the management component, will then give you the overall GRESB fund scores that you see on the benchmark reports. And so how does this translate into what we see this year? So again, working our way up from the bottom, the main note this year is that you can see the split there of 40-60 has shifted further towards performance this year. So now performance stands at 60% of the assessment in terms of the score. And on top of that, the performance component score this year increased by another 18%. So this fed up into the GRESB asset score, which went up by another 14%, and the overall GRESB fund score went up by 18% as well. So although we did see some modest increases in the management components, most of the change this year in terms of the increases that you're seeing across the benchmark stem from this. And this will be a recurring theme throughout the presentation. So we'll take some looks into what the details of that were a bit later on. So at a high level, starting off with the fund model, so as this is the first time you see this chart, firstly, you'll see here that on the y-axis, we represent the management component scores, and on the x-axis, you have the performance component. And what is quite visible here is that for the second year running, we've seen obviously a steep increase in terms of the average score of the benchmark and its universe. However, particularly the shift between 2020 and 2021 is driven by the performance component. And if we look at the way that this is broken down from a regional level, you can also see here that most of the regions stand side by side, or there's not much difference between them. Oceania does have the best performance score, but these are quite similar to last year. In terms of the asset model, again, a very similar story to what we saw on the fund side. The 2020 scores, again, had a huge increase moving into 2021, particularly on the performance side. And so what we are really starting to see now is, as is evidence from these figures, the differentiation in terms of scores and those who want to stand out really comes from the performance component. However, as a lot of you may have noticed, by looking at this chart, there is a vertical line around the 90-point mark of the performance component, which runs through with a cluster of entities there. So this cluster effectively represents a group of over 70 entities who have all scored a maximum score on the performance component, bar the certifications aspect. And this is, I guess, the first time in the presentation where we kind of want to point out the fact that potentially GRESB will be looking to move, or it's a pointer as to why GRESB should move towards more performance-based scoring, and not just on the ability to report, but rather on the actual operational values and comparing entities versus specific market targets, or benchmarking them to performance of peers. So again, as we are in the European presentation, a quick look here at how the European entities fare across the board. As you can see, the European average stands very close to the global average. And this is no surprise, seeing as the European sample size and the number of participants is by some way the largest. So it represents the benchmark, and there is nothing too important to inform on that level. However, if we look at the regional breakdowns, here you can see that the Americas this year have the highest average. But this is, compared to the other three major regions. However, this is different to last year, where most of them were lumped up together and failed to stand out from one another. So this is one thing we have noted this year: America's very strong growth compared to other regions. Then, in terms of the asset sector results, this graph here effectively shows you the number of participants by sector, followed by the average score of that sector, as well as a little marker that indicates the comparison versus 2020, so whether they've had a growth in their average score or a decrease. As is very visible, we have green all around. So all of the sectors, bar one of them, saw growth this year. However, the standout point comes from the social infrastructure sector, which is also the third largest of the sectors, but this year saw a 22-point increase on their average scores. So a large amount of the growth this year is attributed, can be attributed to them. And naturally, due to having so many participants in the benchmark, they have had quite an impact. So this chart is quite interesting. Effectively, what it's trying to show you is the participants who joined in the first year in 2016 and their progression throughout the years, and respectively then each year as the new participants joined in these different cohorts or groups of classmates, if you will, how their scores have progressed throughout the years. And what you can clearly see as you look at the 2021 side of the plot, that a lot of the scores this year, although there is still, the participants who've been around for longer clearly do show some level of better performance or ability to report, the numbers are getting much more clustered. And this may be due to the fact that the industry is starting to find reporting of sustainability metrics as much more commonplace, it's much more standardized, and jumping into the GRESB assessment is not as much of a challenge as it perhaps used to be, as the requirements and the data that's needed to complete the assessment become more available. It could also be due to the fact that many of our managers, begin to reach out to other assets and other funds, and there is sort of a cross-pollination in terms of the learning patterns and the efficiencies. So it's all very positive to see. You can also notice that the light blue line, so the fourth year consecutive participants this year took over the third year participants, which lagged behind last year. And this is actually, again, due to the social infrastructure sector really increasing their numbers this year, and many of the participants from the social infrastructure category having joined in that fourth year. All right. Now, in terms of the aspect results, what we really want to highlight here is, again, in this windrows diagram, what it's trying to show you is each slice of a windrows, which represents the weight of the score in each aspect of our assessment. The dark blue-green lines represent the average of last year, and the light shaded zones are demarking the score that the average for that particular aspect reached this year. And what we kind of want to bring your attention to is specifically the greenhouse gas aspect, which had a 17 points increase, as well as the health and safety aspect. And now, of course, the health and safety aspect has, alongside the risk management aspect, the highest weight in terms of an aspect in our assessment. And that naturally had a very high impact on the changes around scoring. And if we delve into the reporting of the performance component, we sort of start to see this picture a bit more clearly. So what you're looking at here is a graph that depicts along the x-axis the different years, so in clusters of 3 years, and the issues along the top, so the different performance metric issues. And the 0 to 100% bar represents at 100% all of the entities for whom the issue was material to. So in other words, when the materiality assessment was carried out, whether those specific issues were deemed as material or highly material or relevant. As you can clearly see here, from the vast majority of the metrics, there was a significant increase in entities' ability to report on the various numbers. So again, this is not telling you anything about the performance itself, the values themselves, but this is rather showing that all the entities now are, especially on the health and safety side, are able to report in almost all cases to metrics that are deemed material to them. So this explains the increase in score. However, what this also kind of suggests is that we should move towards more performance-driven scoring in order to differentiate the assets. So GRESB's view is that it will, along with its foundation members, explore and review how performance could influence the scoring in subsequent iterations of our assessment. And we've already seen attempts of this in the industry. So if we look at on the EU taxonomy side, they've introduced various thresholds, so known as the technical screening criteria, which attempt to help define whether an asset's activities are sustainable based on environmental and social performance. So we'll be able to use the numbers that are being reported here, both to, it's great to see that there is more reporting and that it's becoming more commonplace, but it also builds a foundation to move towards more performance-based scoring. And what you can also clearly see here on the next graph, this represents the target setting on all those various performance metrics, which we looked at in the prior graph. And you can see that indeed target setting is less common. But again, we did see growth this year in terms of the percentage of participants who do set these targets. And again, the applicability of this in terms of EU taxonomy could be useful in that the target setting, we could look at target setting of the various entities and see whether they are planning to or moving successfully towards the various thresholds that are being set by the EU taxonomy, and to deem whether those assets could, and whether their activities could become deemed as sustainable activities based on taxonomy. So thanks for this part of the presentation. I will now hand over to my colleague Fabio, who will discuss the GHG net zero target emission trend, which has become quite talked about in the industry in recent times.
Indeed, thanks again, David, and thanks again all for being here today. It's great to see you all. As part of our analysis, we decided, of course, to focus and delve a bit more into the net zero target emission setting, because while we saw that part of the score increase is indeed coming from these metrics, and while in light of initiatives and conferences like the COP26, we found this extremely relevant and important to bring the statistics from GRESB. So I will get started with this first slide. Here you basically see a first analysis we did on the fund level. So, well, David already explained to you before how the assessment is structured, but just this was like basically on the fund assessment level. And what we first looked at, we look at asset managers and their commitment towards targets that could be all the targets, but also and especially net zero targets, which are indeed the one that we're mostly focused on now. So, well, you can see starting from the very top of this slide, well, we identified 40% of all the fund managers and the fund participants within GRESB to have sets and are being signatories of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. Now, what's this initiative? Well, this is basically an initiative designed to set net zero goals by 2050 in line with global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So just to give you some basic numbers, well, starting from the top, you see this first line, that's basically the GHG, so greenhouse gases reduction targets for all assets. So what do I mean with that? Well, just for instance, think about a fund with 10 underlying assets. Here we're looking at all the assets, all the 10 assets in this case of the fund, who reported a target. And we identified only 19% of funds being in this kind of situation. Whereas in the second line, you see a similar situation, but in this case, we're looking at funds who have at least one of their assets setting net zero targets. So to bring to you again, the example we had before, well, imagine a fund with 10 underlying assets. In this case, we identified at least one of these assets with the targets. And we see 34 funds, roughly 23% of the universe for the net zero, whereas we see 85 funds, 57% for the non-net zero targets. Of course, that doesn't come with a surprise. We do see more participants having general targets, and we see a bit less participants having net zero targets. You see 85 funds in the first case, 34 in the second one. Really cool. As David said before, we have 149 participants for the fund assessment this year. And lastly, for this part, if you look at the very bottom of the graph, you will see SBT targets. SBT targets are nothing less than science-based targets, which are a set of goals developed by a business to provide it with a clear route or path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we identified no funds with all the underlying assets to have this kind of science-based targets. But when it comes to looking at funds who have at least one asset setting science-based targets, we identified a 9% coverage. So now the next question that arises for us was like, well, we look at commitment on the fund level, but what about the asset level side? And that's what we looked at here. From this graph, you see, well, we plot it and we look at data from the past three years. Why we did that? Well, because that's the assessment were fairly equal in those past 3 years, and hence we could compare the numbers properly. And just eyeballing through it, you will see that the trend is very much positive. And indeed, when it comes to target, they are not net zero. In 2019, we had only 13% of the asset participants who reported those targets, whereas in 2021, so this year, the number has doubled and is 26, despite the fact that we saw increase in terms of GRESB participation, also the asset level. A similar story applies to net zero. Of course, net zero is going a bit slower, as we saw before, so we went from 6% to 8%. But indeed, what we can say is that the trend is positive nonetheless. Now, another question we posed to ourselves was very much tied to the general nature of infrastructure. We do know that infrastructure is extremely diversified. And so we ask, well, but how do different sectors compare one each other? You know, you can imagine that social infrastructure may be extremely different from transport or renewable power, for instance. And that's what we see and what we identified in this slide. So we did nothing less than doing a sector breakdown. We just took the different sectors and look at the net zero targets, again, in this case. This is, again, scope 1, 2, and 3, so direct and indirect emissions. And, well, it's very clear from this graph that the story is a very sector-driven story and pathway, with renewable power playing the biggest role here. Indeed, in 2020, renewable power was having 75% of all the net zero targets, so was representing definitely the biggest role in this case. And it was followed by data infrastructure, transport, and partially by social infrastructure. The story and the numbers are fairly similar and comparable in 2021 as well. Somebody could ask, well, why actually in 2021 renewable power decreased in terms of net zero target out of the old coverage? Well, we kind of have an explanation for this as well. And David before was saying that participation has increased this year and has increased a lot when it comes to renewable power. And that's actually one of the main reasons. So we saw 60%, roughly 50 new entities of the new participants being from renewable. And we do know that it takes some time to adjust and to sharpen the skills when it comes to reporting at GRESB. So next, what we also looked at, well, we looked at the horizon of those target setting, right? Because you can imagine that you can have a future year target, but a target set for the next year or set for 2050 can be and is very different. So that's what we did here. If you look on the left side of this slide, you see this bar chart. This bar chart is basically a breakdown of the future years for the net zero target setting. And you can see that 50% of those targets were set for 2021. Recall this year, the reporting period was for 2020. So that means the year after. And then you see that actually we have fairly similar intervals when it comes to more longer term target sets. So we have 13% for 2025 and for 2035. And we have, well, for 2050, which is the net zero goal for the G20 countries, we have only 4%. And the pie chart on the right side is just displaying the sector breakdown for the 2021 target emissions. So again, as we saw before, it doesn't come with a big surprise. This is very much sector driven. And also in this case, 75% of all the targets for 2021 were set by renewable power assets. So lastly, what we also looked at, and it was those entities that were able already to meet their targets. So the target that they reported and set within GRESB in previous years. You can imagine that it's very important to have a plan and set future year targets, but it's also extremely relevant to look at the targets that already have been met. And from this chart, well, you see again a picture that is not very new to us. Renewable is leading the way with 63% of all the targets met within the infrastructure asset assessment in 2021 being part of renewable. And you see also some other sectors which are kind of following: social infrastructure above them and data infrastructure. Now they also have the biggest shares and portion here, meaning that hopefully they will catch up in the future with renewable. So in summary, this analysis underlines that target settings are increasing. That's true for both funds and asset participants, and that renewable energy is leading the way, confirming steady commitments for the sector, and of course, confirming a strong traction when it comes to set targets, both net zero and non-net zero. So thanks a lot for this part. I'm now giving the words back to David. He will just give you a short introduction of some new products that GRESB is introducing, namely Tcfd and Sfdr.
Thanks, Fabio. So yeah, in order to wrap up this presentation, we'll be giving a quick summary of two of the tools that our teams have been working really hard on and are planning to have made available for the year 2022. The first of which is the Tcfd alignment report. So what effectively we're trying to do with this tool is provide an assessment for entities who do want to carry out this particular Tcfd assessment on how they align with the various processes that are covered in Tcfd. So it will be indicators. The report will cover all the 11 indicators and disclosure requirements that are listed out in Tcfd. And effectively, a lot of these indicators that the reports can be based on will have already been built in or were built in this year into our current asset and fund assessments. And so for those who would like this, effectively, you'll receive a report which will give you a benchmark on how other entities are managing the same climate-related issues, as well as then naturally allow those participants to promote the fact that they are already aligned or reporting on these various 11 disclosures to their investors. Naturally, as always, GRESB looks to take advantage of the reporting efficiencies which already exist and alignment with the GRESB asset and fund assessments. And so that's something that certainly we'd advise you to look out for or hope that you would look out for, as it will be an exciting tool for many and useful, I'm sure. And So as I mentioned, we introduced some of these indicators which relate to TCFD in both assessments this year. So here's one example of the core ones, which had to do with adoption of climate-related risk management processes. And what you can already see is that in terms of on the fund side, those who introduce these who already adopt these climate risk management processes at the transition risk level already stands at about the 75% mark, with about 70% of them identifying and doing impact assessments on this. At the asset level, it's a bit lower, but it's around the 50% mark. Whereas if we look at the physical risk level, so again, those who have climate-related risk management processes for the physical risks, we see that it is indeed still around the 75% mark for funds. However, only 50% of the entities who reported on this had identification and impact assessments. And on the asset side, the numbers are quite similar. In terms of those overall, I've got to mention who actually selected yes to this indicator. It stands at about 114 out of the 149 for fund, and 279 out of the 558 for assets. So it's quite significant in terms of those who are already reporting on these figures, which is great to see. And lastly, our Sfdr reporting solution. So the new Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulations, otherwise known as Sfdr, have come into play and will continue to bring new reporting requirements to many of the financial market participants in the infrastructure sector over the coming years. And so GRESB is looking to launch a tool with the support of participants, to support participants with their disclosures, starting with the principal adverse impact disclosures known as the PAIs. Then this will happen as of, again, the reporting year 2022. For those who are already participating in GRESB or that are planning to, the Sfdr assessment will go hand in hand with the existing infrastructure assessment, and should reduce reporting burden to that degree. The additional value, of course, of this tool for the asset specifically is that it will allow them to get ahead of their CSRD requirements, which should come into effect as of 2024. And as you will have noticed, we have a QR code there that should allow you to get to the landing page for our and a sign up page for our webinars on November 9th. And these webinars will give you a much more detailed overview to the sort of the highlights that I just gave now around this tool. So I will hand over now back to David Thomas, who will walk us through the sector leaders. Thank you.
David, Fabio, thank you very much, and really great insight there. Now, so in honor of our sector leaders this year, we've decided to plant another forest. Treatim is a certified B Corporation business that meets the highest standards of verified social and environmental performance, public transparency, and legal accountability to balance profit and purpose. A certification that we at GRESB are also working to achieve. They work with local communities around the globe to plant trees not only to absorb CO2, combat soil erosion, enrich biodiversity and other environmental benefits, but also to support these communities with additional food sources and economic opportunities. Treatim also allows us to follow along with the stories of our trees. For instance, in Kenya, we have some pictures of nurseries in Kisii and Thika, where they are growing avocados and mangoes, amongst other things. They are also enabling local farmers to raise chickens and hens and piloting a beekeeping project to improve avocado harvest and create additional income for locals. Our forest in Guatemala contains coffee trees. In the photo on your right, you'll see a project happening in Petatan dedicated to female empowerment. As of nearly all profitable businesses, the trade in crops such as coffee and cocoa has long been a world reserved for men. But in partnership with other organizations, Treatim is supporting local female entrepreneurs throughout the entire crop cultivation and production process. It really is an inspiring program and something we're very proud to be a part of. Now then, before moving on to our next session, it's time to take a few moments to congratulate our sector leaders, who you should see across your screens now. Yes, there we are. On behalf of everyone here at GRESB, great job. Thank you for your leadership, for your continuing to drive our industry standards and your ongoing commitment. It's through striving for a better performance like this that all of us as an industry can continue to innovate, to challenge, to push ourselves forward. So thank you for leading from the front. Congratulations on all of your achievements. Now, I think we will go back to David and Fabio for the live Q&A following the results session now.
Actually, David, I think the questions have been answered online, so we'll if it's okay, we'll progress on with the next presentation. But thank you,
No
David and Fabio. So now we move on to the first of our presentations for this afternoon. So if I can just hand over to Catriona, please, if you would like to switch on your microphone and talk us through your presentation. Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you, Matthew, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I will keep going unless told otherwise, but thank you for the introductions, and also my congratulations to all of the sector leaders congratulated today, and to GRESB for championing such fantastic ambition across the built environment industry. My name is Katrina Brady. I'm Director of Strategy and Development at the World Green Building Council, based here in London. And it's my absolute pleasure to give you an overview of the World Green Building Council's very latest report. We literally published it on Thursday, so this is the first time I'm speaking externally about it. And it is called Beyond Buildings: Why an Integrated Approach to Buildings and Infrastructure is Essential for Climate Action and Sustainable Development. Next slide, please. So, as a quick word for those of you who don't know us already, the World Green Building Council is a global network who are leading the transformation of the built environment to make it healthier and more sustainable through the collective work of our green building councils in 70 countries and the 36,000 members who come together to make up our global network. As a network, we're dedicated to achieving the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals, as Matthew talked us through earlier, and we're building on the work that the Green Building Councils have done on both buildings and infrastructure, specifically around 3 strategic focus areas of climate action, health and well-being, and resource efficiency and the circular economy. Next slide, please. So, as I said, it's a real pleasure to be here today, and in the next 10-15 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through at a very high level the most executive summary of this report that we have just published, the high level messages about why we're realizing that we need to take an integrated approach to buildings and to infrastructure in order to be able to maximize our climate action in this very urgent time frame. So I will begin with a wee bit of background information on the urgency of fighting climate change. I'm sure you all know that. We'll move into discussing the levers for change, what we've analysed as our theory of change, and how we think that should lead us forward into calling for a framework of principles. And I'll conclude with some calls to action. Thank you. So starting with the need for a green built environment, the urgency. I'm sure many of you have seen already in the news this morning that the latest CO2 emission figures have come out showing that carbon emissions rose at a higher rate last year than in the previous decade. So the urgency of these statistics is even more imperative. But for buildings and for infrastructure, we know from the latest global status report that buildings alone account for 37% of energy-related carbon emissions. But once you bring in infrastructure as well, we're looking at 75% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions, which is obviously the overwhelming majority and is a sector that must take absolute priority. In terms of population growth and patterns, we know that our world is increasingly urbanizing. Cities hold the bulk of our GDP, and the increasing proportion of our population are living in cities, which is now over 50% and expected to grow up to 70%, which consequently means that our requirement for built environment floor space will increase, both buildings and infrastructure, with the statistic that always surprises me that over the next 40 years, we'll be building a city the size of Paris every week. Consequently, we will be continuing to extract resources. We hope they're not virgin resources. We aspire for a circular economy, but statistics suggest that 40 to 50% of resources are used for the built environment. So for this range of environmental reasons, both carbon emissions and climate change mitigation, but also resource efficiency and nature, as Matthew touched on in his opening words, it's absolutely imperative that we tackle our buildings and infrastructure subsectors. Next slide, please. So just to share really quickly the terminology that we're using for infrastructure, for the purpose of the fact that I'm conscious we have so many people here and there are a real diversity in terms and definitions. The World GBC has adopted the OECD definition, and we also align very closely with GRESB while undertaking this work. So we're using terminology around horizontal infrastructure, so that considering in that transportation, roads, railways, bridges, power and communications, so transmission facilities, electricity lines, how we generate our energy, and then subterranean communications as well, and pipelines and sewage and water lines and everything else. Then in vertical infrastructure, which we also have heard the term social infrastructure already being used today. Within that, we're meaning buildings and spaces that are being used or facilitate the delivery of social services by government or public facilities or service providers. So that's buildings like hospitals or schools, public housing, public universities, that kind of thing, as well as other surfaces and structures. So that's the scope of what we mean when I am talking about infrastructure just now. And if I can take you on to the next slide, thank you. In understanding both the urgency and the scope that captures really all areas of our built environment, World GBC began this work earlier this year, and we decided to step back and embark on an analysis of the differences, but also the interdependencies of the building and infrastructure subsectors. Now, although they undeniably vary massively in so many ways, what we realized was that there were two core areas in which they're interdependent. And so those are, of course, critical for our decarbonization journey, our sustainability ambition. And those are operationally, they're in interdependence in use. The fact that, although perhaps different in purpose, buildings and infrastructure together are what make up our cities, our urban ecosystems. Buildings, you could say, can't exist without the infrastructure to serve them. And we can also say that the purpose of a great deal of our infrastructure is to provide or to service the buildings that we live or work or are educated or go to in our day-to-day lives. Then looking back along the supply chain as well, the shared construction supply chain is another core sustainability reason, another core interdependency of why we should be considering buildings and infrastructure together in the real estate sector. We know they broadly use similar materials, operate similar processes of design and construction, arguably with different stakeholders and timeframes, but the process is generally reasonably similar, but with a shared materials supply chain, particularly important for our work on aspiring for a circular economy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that takes me to my top level heading here on this slide, what the real fundamental basis of this report is. That the relationship between buildings and infrastructure is clear for our sustainability movement, that buildings cannot decarbonize without infrastructure, and that we need infrastructure to create and to support the healthy, resilient, sustainable places that people want to live and work in, and to support thriving economies. And so we at the World Green Building Council believe, after having stepped back and undertaken a consultation with our network, working with many of the colleagues at GRESB, that to tackle the contribution of our built environment to this urgent sustainability crisis, our whole built sector needs to be able to act as a coherent suite of systems. We need to use the same language, have shared ambition, and not act as a set of siloed subsystems. Next slide, please. So in recognizing that we need to bring together the building and the infrastructure worlds to consider the shared opportunities and challenges, I'll just highlight a couple of these opportunities very quickly. I mentioned 3 strategic areas at the beginning of climate, health, and resource efficiency, and there's certainly opportunities under each of these areas, plus many more. But under climate action, firstly, looking at climate change mitigation, we know that both sectors can't decarbonize on their own. Buildings cannot become net zero in the majority of cases if they're not supported by a decarbonized grid, whereas infrastructure, you could say, cannot provide net zero if there's no demand. Then in terms of resilience, also captured within climate action, the adaptation and resilience side of that, we know we are facing unavoidable climate impacts. We know that even if we decarbonize fully tomorrow, we've got 2 to 3 decades worth of climate impacts embedded within our climate system. So resilience to both the environmental impacts, but also systemic stresses, pandemics, economic impacts. We need to be building in resilience to all of these in our built environment. And action at the individual asset level just cannot ensure a resilient community that provides social value and protection for people against these range of forthcoming future challenges if infrastructure is not being considered as well. Then in terms of health and well-being, I think we all know, particularly after the world of the last 2 years, we've lived through that health, air quality, equity, biophilia, so many other health and well-being considerations are definitely tackled at the building level. But we need to be also considering infrastructure if we want to be getting to meaningful outcomes. And I think air quality is a great example of that, that it's a huge concern right now because of COVID-19 transmission. But we need to consider that to achieve good air quality needs to consider tackling the pollutants that are facilitated by the infrastructure in our cities. So our transport network, our power supply, amount of green space, urban layout, as well as the building level considerations of ventilation, monitoring, purification, cleaning in addition. On resources and circularity, as I mentioned, both sectors rely on the same supply chains. So there are certainly opportunities for material reuse that come from the economy of scale that incorporating infrastructure and buildings together would allow, with demand generation that's really difficult to simulate on an individual asset basis, for giving them the initial inertia needed for a circular economy. And finally, public procurement. I'll touch on this a bit more in a few minutes, but there is such a huge opportunity for alignment in this space with both sectors, buildings and infrastructure, talking with governments, working with governments, and publicly owned infrastructure and buildings are an opportunity for increasing efficiency and having this aligned ambition and benchmarking as well. But we will come back to that. Next slide, please. Picking up briefly what Matthew said in the introduction earlier today, that the shared opportunities for buildings and infrastructure are also noted within the Sustainable Development Goals. 11 of the 17 directly relate to the built environment. And even at the very highest level, this shows that the sustainability targets that governments and major organizations have committed to adhere to require our built environment to be treated holistically. Next slide, please. So what are some of the levers for change and who are the actors needed to move towards this systemic approach? I will run through this very quickly, but suggest you go to the report for more information and case studies for each of these areas. Firstly, looking at the investment opportunity and the community represented on this webinar today, we see investment as a necessary catalyst in this transition. Estimates say that we need $5 trillion a year of investment to create sustainable infrastructure to meet 2050 needs. And there is substantial opportunity here to make sure we aren't locking future emissions into our infrastructure network because of the lifespan of some of these built assets. The benefit for investors being that a sustainable built environment should represent a better quality asset, maintained to a higher standard, a better return on investment. And we know the trajectory of engagement with sustainability is clear. We've seen from the results today, we know that reporting of sustainability has increased dramatically in the last decade. And I think that the leadership in GRESB has been something to be congratulated here. So the congratulations from World GBC for your leadership there. World GBC is actually publishing a long-awaited update to our business case report. We are releasing beyond the business case. It is called on the 4th of November. We're launching it in person in Glasgow, if any of you will be at COP26. So for more on the business case, I'd encourage you to look at that next week. On the other side of the coin is public procurement, by which I mean, of course, the process by which public money is spent on construction and operation of vertical and horizontal infrastructure and other public resources and services. And as Matthew mentioned, public procurement and sustainable infrastructure in general has the opportunity to meet a huge proportion of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, with particular impact noted for SDG 11, which is about sustainable cities. Finally, in terms of benchmarks, it's absolutely clear that the role of benchmarks and rating tools and certifications have hugely advanced the sustainability industry through raising awareness and offering investment criteria and giving us ambition and performance tracking. And these tools have undoubtedly been a great reference point for public procurement and for capital markets, but there's certainly opportunity for more cohesion and efficiency in current practice. And I was really interested to hear the call about the potential move towards operational performance measurement from the GRESB team. I look forward to hearing more on that. Next slide, please. So just showing this visually very quickly, in terms of the geographic pattern around this opportunity, it certainly is global. We know that there's a requirement in all markets to support the growth and prosperity of communities, but the demand over time is largest in Asia and other emerging markets. You can see this, I appreciate it's very small on your screen, but the expected growth in built floor areas is shown by the concentric rings on the graph, and that will need to be supported by future infrastructure, with the largest predicted built environment growth to occur in the global south. The graphic also shows, if you dig into it, the governance around sustainable infrastructure rating tools. And you can see that tools that already exist on the market, such as SQL or Envision, show really, really good coverage in established markets, but there is more limited coverage in places of greatest future growth. Next slide, please. So that brings me to what World GBC believes our theory of change is for mass transformation of the built environment. A global framework of principles required for accelerating sustainability performance to be adapted and verified at the local level that aligns to the 1.5-degree emissions trajectory. We need the local flexibility and adaptability for the range of built environment subsets, but also different geographies, priorities, climate, governance mechanisms. And World GBC will follow the precedent in setting sustainability principles that we've done around net zero, around health and well-being, and we plan to continue around the circular economy next year. And we envisage that principles that are high level but able to be adapted could be embedded within procurement tenders or contracts, or constitute investment criteria or KPIs for ESG, as well as design or development guidelines. Next slide, please. So coming into my conclusion, I think it's clear from what we've heard so far today, and hopefully from what I've spoken to you about so briefly, that to tackle this overwhelming proportion of our carbon emissions and bring about wider change in sustainable development, recovery of biodiversity, we need our built environment to speak with one voice. We need a clear narrative from the whole built environment sector that will send signals to the institutions that build and renovate our places, our cities. And that's, yes, our governments, but it's also the construction industry, the supply chain. And we know the latter industries are highly traditional, very divided industries that just by their very makeup and globality are just naturally resistant to change. Next slide, please. So our call to action for the industry through this report is that World GBC is advocating for the need for collaboration to establish this aligned global ambition and coverage for all built assets across all geographies. We believe that a common set of principles across investment, across procurement, design, operation in the built environment would support and help to clarify what's needed for this rapid action that's being called for at a time when we know urgency absolutely must be the priority. So we call for investors and actors like yourselves to increasingly be demanding that climate action and social value and resource efficiency within all projects that you are financing, developing, owning, or even occupying as well. And you continue to increase ambition with the ESG targets that you're all showing leadership in reporting against. World GBC is building on the work of the green building councils around the world in all areas, and you'll see case studies of this within the report if you care to dive into. And I would encourage any of you who are interested in more information to reach out to your local green building council on what's happening in your geography, or if you would be like, if you would potentially like to be involved in what World GBC will continue exploring in this space into 2022, pursuing this framework of principles, then please do reach out to us as well. This report sounds a call to action for our network and our partners. We are taking it with us as we pack our bags for Glasgow next week. And we truly believe that we must collaborate strongly and align our advocacy, our membership networks, the whole industry, and all the tools operating within it in support of this new trajectory towards urban sustainability. Thank you so much for your time today. On the next slide, you can see contact details if you have any questions or would like to download the report, and I will happily take any questions just now. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for an excellent presentation. I'm sure there are 1,000,001 questions. I've certainly got loads. I'm conscious that we're running slightly behind schedule at the moment, so in the interest of time, if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to move on to the next presentation for this afternoon, which will be Fraser. Fraser, could I just hand you the floor and ask you to talk through the index and your experiences 1 year in? Fraser, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Matt. You can hear me, but you can't see me. Is that correct?
As long as we can hear you, that's perfectly good.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
All right, great. Hey, thanks to GRESB and thanks to Matt and EVORA for inviting me to present today. My name is Fraser Hughes. I'm the CEO and founder of GLIO, the Global Listed Infrastructure Organization. Next slide, please. We were established in 2016, and really we've been working with GRESB from day one. We were founded by 10 founding members, mainly from the investment management community. We've grown over the last 5 years. We're now at 70 members. Approximately half of those members come from the dedicated listed infrastructure managers, and half of the members now come from the listed companies. If you tally up the market cap of the listed companies, that is now over and above $1 trillion of market cap. And in enterprise value terms, that's around about $1.5 trillion of enterprise value. The investment managers themselves, they manage approximately 115 billion of equities in the listed infrastructure space. Okay, next slide. Okay, these are the basics of the GLIO index. So that's the parent index of the GLIO GRESB ESG index. It's really simple. It's based on the backbone of EDX TICS classification system. We're looking at 75% of EBITDA coming from regulated network utilities, renewables, energy transportation and storage companies, transportation companies, and communications infrastructure, excluding the data centers. So we're really just looking at the tower type companies there. In terms of free float market capitalization, companies must be over, at the moment, it's around about 500 million in free float market cap. And companies, of course, must have good tradability, good liquidity. So we look for at least 25% of shares at an annual level to be traded. But in reality, that tends to be on average around about 100% of a company's shares will be traded throughout the year. In the lower part of the slide in green, you see the filter that we effectively put on the ESG index. So we take GRESB scores. So we've just updated those scores in the last round for public disclosure. And we put those scores into a banding system. So a few examples: if a company scores a 91, we will round that up in the banding system to 100% of the company's original weight in the GLIO index. That will go into the ESG index. And 83 will get 90% of the original weight. A 45 will get 50% of the original rate, and an 18 will only get 20% of the original rate. So what's clear here is we don't exclude companies, but we will weight them down for poor performance in public disclosure. And one key point to note on this slide, the ground rules of the index, they are governed and managed by the GLIO index committee. So it's important to note that the industry effectively steers how we maintain and how we develop the index series going forward. Okay, next slide. Okay, when we apply the ground rules, well, what do we actually get? What's the size of the market? The blue kind of area, that represents the historic market cap, full market cap over time. So we've gone from around about 500 billion back in 1999 to over 3 trillion at this moment in time. The dark blue line is the free float market cap. So around about 90% of the index we will classify as free float or tradable market cap. We've also put, just to compare size between the listed and the unlisted market there, we've put in Preqin's estimation of the size of their market. So the red dotted line, that is total assets under management on the unlisted side. The green line is realized value or invested in infrastructure assets, and the light blue line is the current level of dry powder. So if you compare the two markets, the market cap is around about 5 to 6 times larger than the unlisted side. If you look at EV terms, and I think that's the Apple's Apple's comparison, we're about 8 times larger than the current level of the unlisted market. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is really a slide about how engaging has counted in the last round of public disclosure. Of the 160 companies in the index, we had 52 companies give us feedback or engage with us on their public disclosure score. What was really, I think alarming for me was 51 of those companies came from the developed markets and only 1 came from emerging markets. So we've got a lot of work to do going forward, engaging with the emerging market companies. Of the 52 companies that engaged, they represented about 53% of the total market cap of the index, or that's around about 1.5 trillion of market cap. And what you do see is there's a significant difference in the average size of those companies who engaged. So around about 32 billion of market cap for an engaging company. These are averages, by the way. And in terms of those companies that did not engage, the average was about 14 billion. So those companies that engaged a lot larger. And, perhaps that's because they've actually got the resource in-house to engage with us. That might be one reason. Okay, next slide. Again, just building on the engagement counts, what we do here is we also do the averages. So if you look at all engaged, on average, they scored 75 points. When you compare that with non-engaged, that's at the top of the table, they scored 52 points. So there's really a significant difference in the quality of their scores. We also break it down into market cap sizes as well. So companies over 20 billion that engaged on average scored nearly 80 points, which would have been an A, but certainly a high B at 79. Between 10 and 20 billion, 73 points, and under 10 billion, 67 points. So the larger companies tended to score better. And you can see that they compare rather favorably against the companies that did not engage. And a nice point at the bottom of this table for me, the GLIO members, they scored on average 70 points versus the non-members who didn't engage at 61 points. So again, a significant difference. So it's clear engagement counts in pushing up those scores. Okay, next slide. And again, the GLIO members score higher. What's important here is we've got 4 years now of data. here, and what you've seen is the GLIO members, well, just because I guess they're aligned with what we're doing as an organization, they have actually improved at a faster rate. So back in 2018, average score was 44, and now they're up to 70 points, as I mentioned earlier. You do see improvement in the non-members, but at a lesser to a lesser degree. So over the course of the 4 years, they've added 12 points to 61 of their score. Okay, next slide. Okay, going back to what I said earlier, it's a clear difference between what you see from the developed and the emerging market companies. Developed markets make up about 95% of the market cap of the index. Emerging markets around about 5%. Look, it's a big difference from the emerging markets versus the developed markets scores. All of the developed market regions, Americas, APAC, Europe, Middle East and Africa and Oceania, score in the B category. North America, this is a point I'd like to make, is the best improving. So out of the developed markets regions, it still lags behind, but it's improved the best over the last 4 years. So really coming from a low C to just tipping into the B level at the last round. And again, you know, we need to do more work, I think, in the emerging markets going forward in terms of engagement. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we just look at the developed markets for these averages, and what we do is we break down the average scores by TICs or edX TIC sector codes. What you see is the toll roads and the airports are well into the B category, and they have been actually over the last 4 years of the historical data that we have. Electric utilities, which make up just under half of the market cap of the index, they're now in the B category, but they've improved consistently year on year. So they've gone from a 49 up to 65 from a C to a B in rating terms. And the rest of the sectors, with the exception of marine ports and satellites, which are quite small in market cap terms, they all score a B rating on average. Okay, next slide. Again, we just do the same thing for the countries as well. I think the UK and Spain really kind of stand out. The UK, actually the first country that looks like it might hit an A score going forward, really just on the edge now of an A. The USA is actually down the list, but again, USA, you know, improving, I would say, consistently year on year over time, you know, going from a B, a high D back in 2018 to a high C currently. So you've seen consistent improvement across all of the countries, with the exception of France, which is a little bit of a surprise this year round as well. Okay, next slide. These are the top 20 companies in the index by market cap. Look, in summary, 5 of the companies by market cap, they get A scores: American Tower, Iberdrola, Canadian National Railway, AEP and Sempra. The vast majority in this list, 13 companies, they score a B rating, which is great, of course, and you've got 1 or 2 companies in there at C or D below. Okay, next slide. Okay, now this is really a marked improvement, I would say, on the last years that we've done the public disclosure analysis. So for the first time in collecting this data, we almost see the top 20 companies hitting an A rating. So you've got 19 companies in the index hitting an A rating. If you compare that with 2020, we have 5 companies with an A rating. 2019, we have 5 companies with an A rating, and 2018, we have 4 companies with an A rating. So I think really the pushing that GLIO and GRESB did in getting companies to engage has really paid off in this year's public disclosure scores. Okay, next slide. Okay, so in putting the index together, we've now got a little bit of history. We've now nearly got a full 3 years history for the GLIO GRESB ESG index. What we do in this graph is compare the ESG index, which is the green solid line, with the GLIO parent index. And what you see is they're, highly correlated with each other. At an annualized level, they're returning around about 10% per annum over that 3-year period. What we also do in this graph is compare the unlisted market. So the solid red line is Preqin Infra, and the dotted red line is edX Equity 300 index. And on average, over the 3-year period, they perform around about 7.5% per annum. But look, as we all know, infrastructure is not a short-term asset class, it's a long-term asset class. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you long-term performance versus the GLIO index. If you go to the next slide, please. Hello. Yeah, there we go. So the red line in this graph is Preqin infrastructure index. This is over a 19-year history. And what we do is chart the GLIO index, the parent index, which is the dark blue line, over the same period. And what you see is over the medium to long term, they basically give you the same level of performance. So, you could argue that listed infra is a good proxy for direct infrastructure. We also put a few of the other asset classes on there as well. Global REITs are in grey and global equities in blue. Okay, next slide. And one of the things that we've been talking about more recently as an organization is the ability to put together basically a hybrid allocation. So the mix of unlisted and listed infrastructure. You can actually read about this in the latest edition of the GLIO journal. And I think if the slides are distributed later on, you can if you can go back one slide, thanks. You can read more about that, and you can click on those kind of icons to the right-hand side. But basically, what this graph tells you is that if you blend the GLIO with edX, or if you blend the GLIO with Preqin, you can push out the efficient frontier of the optimal mix of both listed and unlisted allocations. Okay, and on to the last slide. Okay, in summary, I mean, the case that I'd like to make, of course, is, listed and unlisted infrastructure are the same. We have the same issues for both the listed and unlisted markets. We have the same regulation. We have the same assets. Well, if, of course, you're using TICS classification, of course. We have the same management expertise that's needed to manage the assets, and as I've shown you in the last couple of slides, we have the same long-term performance between unlisted and unlisted infrastructure. I think the work that we're doing on the ESG index is a great start using public disclosure, but I think, as David pointed out earlier, there's still work to be done, and I think if we can weave in, more data, operating performance of these companies going forward, everyone will benefit from that data. Just in terms of engagement targets, we're really looking now to ramp up the engagement again next year. So I'd be targeting 75% of developed companies feeding back into the public disclosure process. And we really got to make some headway with the emerging markets as well. So I think the target there should be at least 50% of those companies. And then just to end my presentation, for all of those companies that score an A and B this year in public disclosure, we will be awarding medals. And in total, that is 65 companies. So 19 score an A and about 45 score a B. And Matt, back to you. I think I'm in time.
Thank you very much, Fraser. Brilliant coverage, very detailed, and really very informative. I'm aware that we're still running a little bit behind schedule, and I know some of the Q&A box has flagged up some questions, which I believe the GRESB team are responding online as we progress. So if I could just hand over to Nick very shortly. Just to quickly run through, Nick, we've got an online poll being displayed on your screens now. So if whilst Nick does his presentation, if you, the audience, could have a look through those questions and give us your views. I think there are 5 questions in total, so not too many questions to ask. But on that, I will hand over to Nick. Nick, would you like to give us some insights from your experience in the real estate world and to see whether there are any specific learning points for the infrastructure sector?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I'll do my best to squeeze it in the time that we've got left. But what I'd like to do today, is offer a perspective that we've gained from the interaction with the real estate investment manager clients that we have at EVORA, both through the software development that we do as well as the consulting. And I appreciate there are quite a bit of sort of marked differences, despite some of the points we made about kind of the shared interest and aligned objectives. But obviously, there are some quite sort of marked differences in the asset classes. But hopefully, what I can give you is a bit of an overview of what we've learned, and then maybe prompt some discussion. If we have time to prompt some discussion about what you think might be relevant or meaningful for infrastructure. Next slide, please. So the first thing I wanted to start with is really about some of the kind of quite significant and emerging sort of trends or drivers that we're seeing that's really underpinning kind of the engagement with data. And the first thing really is increasing regulation. We've talked about that quite a bit already today, but that really is very true. And what we've seen, the likes of Sfdr, it's really sort of driving a focus on data and interaction with it, in particular how it feeds through to decision useful data, as we've sort of put here. The other aspect to think about, as well as certainly within real estate, we found is the increasing engagement with stakeholders. So, for example, between investment managers and investors. And we've seen definitely an increase of interest, so more requests for information, but also just from the research that we've done, and anecdotally, an increase in the number of requests for information, both in terms of frequency, but potentially also sort of sophistication as well. So more is being asked about, and also kind of with increasing sophistication and intelligence behind kind of some of those questions. And there's an important link to make here around the regulation and also how that relates to engagement with stakeholders, because the regulation is really making investment managers to take responsibility for what they report, which in turn is driving that engagement with stakeholders. The other aspect which is really important is to think about forward-looking. So a lot of reporting to date has very much sort of focused on performance to date or performance kind of up until a certain point. But what we're starting to see is very much more kind of a focus on the forward-looking aspect. And I guess things like, sort of from a real estate perspective, net zero carbon and kind of reaching those sort of science-based targets in the lead up to 2050 is really helping to focus minds. We've seen a lot of public commitments made by our clients and our peers around achieving those goals, but then obviously necessitates some really sort of strategic thinking about how those risks and opportunities will be managed. And again, the legislation comes into this because it not only requires, it requires companies to be forward-looking, as they need to kind of consider and how they would report on how those risks are managed. I've got data quality. I'm sorry, just before we quickly move on to the next slide, data quality is an important aspect here because that really is kind of at the heart of kind of a lot of focus at the moment. Ultimately, we're trying to get to a point where data can be useful for financial decision making. But data quality really is an important point and is really kind of driving a lot of focus at the moment. And the creation of value, I've put that up there because obviously what we're trying to move towards is data that's useful for financial decision making. And the creating value is a really important one. And I think it's kind of two particular salient points. One is really about how companies might use this to identify opportunities. And whilst this isn't a real estate example, I think it's quite a pertinent one. So those will be familiar with the company Dong, who kind of went through a transformation into renewable energy generation. That's a really good example of using information to then reposition from an ESG context. And the other aspect as well is about managing risk and sort of value erosion as the market moves forward and how there could be differentiation in some of the ESG performance between different players. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at data, it's really important to consider this in the context of the metrics themselves or the indicators. I guess that kind of stands to reason, but really the metrics themselves are kind of really kind of stem from some key aspects around, again, regulation. So as new regulations come out and have requirements on metrics, so for example, if we're looking at things like Sfdr and exposure to energy and efficient assets and so on, there's obviously going to be certain metrics that are going to be defining how companies report. Asset standards is another important element. So again, specific to real estate, but you know, these are really how you're able to benchmark how assets are performing, perhaps from an operational perspective, whether it's ratings or benchmarks, and also performance against kind of projections from a decarbonisation perspective. And again, I've noted there about the investor RFIs. So all of these come together to kind of have their own bearing on kind of the need for metrics. But it's important to point out some of the challenges we've seen in the real estate sector is the noise and the mismatch, because that which might be required for regulations or reporting may not necessarily be of the most use for key players in terms of their use of information to understand impact on value. And that's where I put there, from real estate perspective, the conventional ways of measuring value around income, costs, the physical structure of the building, as well as land. And you know, we're really in this point of you know, don't have necessarily all the answers, although there are lots of companies that are moving this forward, is around how you actually measure you know, the impact on value from an ESG perspective. You know, the relationship between metrics and value over time is an important factor, and how the value, or whether or not the value of assets can be differentiated by ESG factors. And I think things like net zero carbon are really important, because companies are going to have different time horizons, you know, in terms of the potential impact on liquidity, depending on the investment strategy. But we're starting to see companies take a sort of a longer look ahead, because you know, even if a company has a shorter term hold period, they could well be selling to a company that has a longer one. And so, you know, we're talking about investment cycles there, which, you know, only so many before we're looking at some of the kind of the milestones on net zero carbon. Next slide, please. So now I just want to move on to some examples to illustrate what we're seeing, to try and bring some of those points to life. And it makes sense to start with data quality, because that underpins so much. As I said, there's a very much an increasing focus on data quality. Again, that stands to reason, because as you're trying to put kind of more emphasis or financial pressure on, you know, to make financial decisions for data, then you want that confidence in the information. But there's two parts to it. One is creating better visibility. So I've got an example here up on screen looking at data coverage. And again, I know that the examples with it are quite real estate specific, but in terms of what our clients have in terms of their ability to understand where you know, efficiencies can be made, the lease structures within real estate, depending on the markets, are quite important, because that gives rise to, you know, decisions about where you have data, where you don't, where you have managerial control, and so on. And so these things are really important to help either inform the data collection process itself, to where you are able to get hold of that data, but also to have visibility about where you can affect change, because that's really important from the perspective of measuring progress against the implementation of reduction strategies. So for example, with carbon and with energy efficiency. And I guess that comes with part and parcel with the increased rigor and focus on data assurance along with that. Next slide, please. I talked before about contracting performance over time. This is a key focus for a lot of our clients within real estate in terms of measuring performance over time. But again, this is usually done within kind of a retrospective context in terms of how you're performing against yourself over time, or assets over time. We'll be able to track against performance against targets. But you know, really with this, there's a lot of complexity, and this the complexity's increased over time. It's gone from being quite what could be a very simple indicator as a sort of a percentage change, and there's a lot that can sit behind that data. So even within a relatively conventional asset that you might be measuring, there might be you know, a range of different occupiers involved, a range of different utility meters, and so there's that complexity in enabling that kind of apples for apples comparison, and to understand where performance can be attributed within those assets, and also at the entity level, is really important. Next slide, please. The forward looking, as I mentioned before, so I've got an example up on screen here just to illustrate around net zero carbon. So that information is used really to help inform how you might transition entities on the journey towards 2050. And this involves a lot of aspects around current operational performance. Obviously in time that's going to be incorporating things around embodied carbon, but just getting a view on the operational performance in relation to carbon intensity and what that means from a sector and country specific pathway perspective is really important, as well as understanding how that performance compares against the market right now. from what's sort of termed as sort of an asset stranding perspective. And so there's a lot of different aspects that feed into this, and it's not just operational performance data. Companies to kind of make intelligent use of this data are also looking at how they collate together information on sustainability asset action plans, as they might be called. And so it's thinking about what CapEx and OpEx they might be planning in tandem with lease and major investment events over the coming months and years to understand what the risks are. And really, there are two levels to this as well. So this is both in terms of transitioning assets or standing assets, in terms of what is cost effective to achieve and to de-risk assets within the portfolio, but also about changing investment decisions about what might come in and out of the portfolio to sort of tilt the fund towards a net zero carbon fund. Next slide, please. And another example I've got on the screen at the moment is the physical climate risk. So again, this is just an example of an increasing breadth of the data in terms of what our clients and users are wanting to see more of in terms of different types of data. And so what we've got is not just the transition risk, but also the physical climate risk elements of it. And whilst this might be in itself using relatively straightforward input data in terms of the physical location of the asset, it's all part and parcel of what goes into an increasing breadth of data that's collected to understand and manage the risks and opportunities across a broader ESG agenda. And we've also talked earlier about some of the speakers have been referring to social data as well. Obviously, there's a kind of materiality aspect to that in terms of, this could be market and asset and sector specific, but nonetheless, we're starting to see more and more focus on a broader range of ESG data types over time. Next slide, please. So I think in summary, hopefully this has been a very quick, although very quick canter through some of the perspectives or the experiences that we've had. Just to round up, we can see there's been certainly an increase in complexity over time, and that's happened relatively quickly as well. A lot of that's been due to an increased rigor and focus on the data itself. There's terms around sort of use of investment grade data, even though historically even non-financial data has been used to inform investment decisions. It's just increasingly important over time. And what we're also finding is that the data needs to be more user-friendly. So we're starting to see trends where it's not just the preserve of the ESG expert to be able to interrogate and report on these things. Increasingly, asset and investment manager roles are also increasingly wanting to get their hands on the data, and that's an important point from an engagement perspective. As I said, regulation is fundamental, it underpins this in terms of the attention that's given. And also, I think there's a real need for consistency and effective engagement, but we need to be mindful of the potential mismatch in what we're seeing in the data. I know that investors obviously want comparability when they see the data, so there's a need for consistency. And things like the EU taxonomy will hopefully sort of drive some of that harmonization. But then nonetheless, it's always going to be maybe a different take on some of the information depending on the investment strategy, and really trying to kind of get a handle on how you actually measure the impact on value from how ESG affects financial decision making. So hopefully that's kind of given some ideas, and I'm not sure if we have time to kind of talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A, but interested to see what people think from what that might mean from an infrastructure perspective.
Thank you, Nick. You're right, we're running a little bit short on time. So if it's okay with everybody, Sasha, would you be kind enough just to quickly display the results from the poll? Because I think there may be some interesting very quick thoughts that we could have before we go to David for the closing remarks. Hopefully everybody can see those interesting responses. So in terms of the first question, what are your priorities in terms of ESG data collection and reporting? It looks a very strong and very encouraging indication that both you're reporting on core and broader social ESG factors, which is great and encouraging to see, and clearly nobody is not collecting any data, so that's a good encouraging thing. In terms of frequency of data collection and reporting and what is most useful to you, interesting to note that it looks like quarterly and annual cycle seems to be the preferred phase of getting data in. Very few on a sort of monthly cycle, which possibly is slightly different from our experiences on the real estate side, and that may be due to the kind of close relationship that asset managers have with managing performance on buildings on a sort of daily basis. But maybe that's something to think about, and perhaps maybe something that could be become more relevant as infrastructure assets of course need performance management just in the same way as other built environment assets do, of course. Does your data management process have checks, i.e. quality checks? And if So very good selection of responses there. So it looks like there's a broad coverage of data quality checks being made, which is encouraging to see. And finally, actually not finally, the penultimate question, which of the following does your reporting cover? Retrospective ESG reporting data or forward-looking data? Very clear indication that most of that data, and it's not a big surprise, is retrospective analysis with perhaps not quite so much forward-looking analysis, but I think that trend will change over time, and certainly forward-looking projections are becoming increasingly the important mode going forward in responding to Sfdr and TCFD. And would an external sector specific benchmark be useful, i.e. carbon management performance and so on? Clear response there from the majority, 84% of you suggest that you really would appreciate a sector specific benchmark to work towards, and that is something that we've noted with our real estate clients as well, and something that I think that's incumbent upon us and GRESB, our colleagues, to come up with suitable benchmarks for you to be able to measure performance against. So some really interesting findings. Hopefully that's a quick whistle through the Q&A. And if I can now hand on to David, would you like to just offer some concluding remarks? I'm conscious we're somewhat over time at this point. So thank you very much, everybody. And by the way, well done with all of your GRESB submissions this year.
Many thanks, Matthew, and thank you to all of our speakers and of course to EVORA today for hosting the event. I'm sure you agree we've had some excellent industry insight there, and certainly a reinforcement of the progress our industry is making on its sustainability journey. If you weren't able to catch everything today, please do remember the full programme and all the slides are available to view on demand via our website. And just a final thank you to you for the engagement and for making this an interactive discussion. It is, after all, you, our industry, who underpin everything we do here at GRESB. And on that note, we'd love to have your input on our recently published 5-year roadmap for the GRESB standards and assessments. If you'd like to share your thoughts, please do visit gresb.com for more details on how to participate in that survey. We are, of course, very much looking forward to speaking with all of you over the course of the next 12 months. And very much hope that this time next year, we'll be able to meet with you in person for the 2022 results event. On behalf of everyone here at GRESB, thank you again for joining us, and goodbye. Thank you.
Congratulations and thank you, everyone.